Hey everyone, thanks for joining me today for episode 628 of People Behind the Science. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today I am joined by our guest, Dr. Cassandra Quave, to talk about life and science. So listeners, I hope you enjoy learning more about the life and career of another researcher in today's episode. And if you want to meet more great people in science, you can check out our website at peoplebehindthescience.com to peruse previous episodes and show notes. Today, Cassandra is going to tell us more about her life, career, and research. So listeners, get ready to meet another one of our fantastic people behind the science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the People Behind the Science podcast. Listeners, today I am thrilled to be speaking with our guest scientist, Dr. Cassandra Quave. So, Cassandra, welcome to our show today. How are you?
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We are really excited to learn more about you and the wonderful work you do. So, let me start by prepping our listeners with a little bit more information about you and your background. So listeners, Cassandra holds a joint appointment as Associate Professor of Dermatology in the Emory University School of Medicine and Emory Center for the Study of Human Health. She is also Director and Curator of the Emory University Herbarium, CEO of CLQ Botanicals, a company providing consulting services on botanicals for personal care, skin health, and cosmetics, CEO and Chief Scientist of PhytoTEK LLC, a startup biotech company dedicated to R&D and commercialization of novel anti-infective technologies. She is host of the Foodie Pharmacology Podcast and author of the recently released book, The Plant Hunter, a scientist's quest for nature's next medicines. Cassandra received her bachelor's degrees in biology as well as anthropology and human biology from Emory University. She was awarded her PhD in biology with a focus in ethnobotany and ethnopharmacology from Florida International University. Next, Cassandra conducted postdoctoral research at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship at Emory University. She joined the faculty there at Emory in 2013. For her teaching, she has been recognized with the Emory Williams Distinguished Undergraduate Teaching Award from Emory University. And Cassandra joins us today to talk more about her life and science. So, Cassandra, we're excited to get to know you as a scientist, but also more generally as a person. So, can you start by telling me and our listeners what you like to do when you're not doing science?
Well, I'm a mom of 4, so a lot of what I do has to do with family time with the kids. I've got 3 teenagers and 1 in elementary school. So when we're not at sporting events with them, we like to go hiking and canoeing and kind of outdoorsy stuff together. I'm also an avid reader, so you find my nose in a book relaxing sometimes. And I also love to swim. That's probably my favorite kind of outdoor activity. I love hiking and swimming with friends.
Phenomenal. Well, I'm sure you keep it quite busy there with your 4 kids and all these fun outdoor activities. You mentioned reading as well, and we love talking books on the show. So, Cassandra, do you have a favorite book or a few books that you'd like to recommend for us today?
Oh, yeah, I have so many books. So I'm currently reading On All Fronts by Clarissa Ward. I was really impressed by her reporting in Afghanistan, and that kind of directed me to her book. And it's really a well-written memoir. I've also enjoyed another recent memoir, Finding the Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard. And I love the interactions in her story about understanding the intricacies of relationships between the forest. And then there was another one that was released last year I really enjoyed. It was called Feasting Wild, and kind of understanding the role of wild foods in human history. So those are just a few of them, but probably my biggest expenses each month are in books.
Well, I know myself, I've got this pile of books I've been meaning to read, and I'm slowly working my way through it, but it seems like I add more to the pile than I'm able to read through. So Well, Cassandra, thank you for these recommendations. We will add On All Fronts, Finding the Mother Tree, and Feasting Wild to our list on our website for our listeners to find. And we talked about kind of life outside of science, but I'd love to talk about your work next. So for our listeners out there who might not be familiar with your work specifically or with your field more generally, how do you describe what you do in the lab?
I describe myself, I guess, best as a medical ethnobotanist. So I'm really interested in the study of how people relate to plants, specifically in how they use plants as medicine. So I do field work in different places across the globe, really documenting these traditional medicinal practices. We collect plants for study in the laboratory. And in the lab, we analyze those plant ingredients through a number of different chemical tools and then also assess their pharmacological activity, primarily against infectious disease targets. So it's a bit of an interdisciplinary lab. We have anthropology side to the lab, botany side, natural products chemistry, and then microbiology and pharmacology.
Wonderful. And I imagine bringing together all these disciplines can be a challenge sometimes. How is it for you trying to kind of balance all these different sides of the work that you do?
It's not easy. My brain's very full all the time. I think the challenge is really keeping up with things and also keeping up with the current literature in different fields, but also really what's enabled us to take this interdisciplinary approach has really been about building an interdisciplinary team. So we have different members on the team. One is a botanist, another is more focused on NMR chemistry, analytical chemistry, another more on mass spectrometry, others more in pharmacology. So it's really great to bring everybody to the table together. So I kind of think of my background in science is I'm able to speak many languages of science in a way. If you think about pharmacology or microbiology as languages, and can help to kind of guide the group that are more classically trained in different specific fields.
Certainly. Well, it's great to hear about what you're doing in the lab today, and I look forward to going into some more of the details as we go through our conversation today. But I know the path of a scientist, and yours was no exception, can be riddled with challenges, so motivation is very important. So we love sharing little bits of motivation and inspiration with our listeners. Cassandra, do you have a favorite quote or a saying or just something that keeps you really motivated and inspired?
Well, one of the fun things about writing a book is I got to pick a number of epigraphs to include in the book. And one of my favorites that I use in chapter 11 that covers my work in the Balkans is one by Madeleine Albright in her book, Madam Secretary from 2003. And her quote was, "I was taught to strive not because there were any guarantees of success, but because the act of striving is in itself the only way to keep faith with life." And that's just really inspiring to me.
I love it. Why did this particular quote maybe speak to your own story specifically?
I think it's reflective of my journey. Growing up, I had many challenges. As a child, I was born with multiple congenital birth defects of my skeletal system. And so just striving to be able to walk was a huge goal when I was a kid. And that journey in overcoming hurdles from early childhood and then hurdles in pursuing my passions in science, it just really taught me and fostered in me this sense of resilience to go after the things that I wanted, even when the odds were heavily stacked against me.
Definitely. And we love talking about the origin stories of scientists. And I think yours is almost like that of a superhero here. So I love to get into some of the details. So Cassandra, can you tell us a little bit more about those early years for you and maybe how this interest in science began?
So as I mentioned, I was born with a number of birth defects. And so I had my leg amputated when I was 3 and I was eventually able to walk with a prosthetic leg after a number of surgeries. I also battled a life-threatening infection at a young age. But when I wasn't using a prosthetic, I would get along on my crutches. And as I mentioned, I'm an avid reader and I also love to be outdoors. So you could often find me climb up high in the boughs of an oak tree in our backyard where I would sit and read or just observe all the little critters that would crawl along on the oak tree. So looking at little beetles and squirrels and birds and investigating all the different epiphytes that grow on these trees. I mean, I think Florida really is a wonderland for anyone that's growing up with an interest in nature because there's just so much diversity of life there. And I got really interested in just observing things. And when I was in the 3rd grade, we had our first opportunity to participate in the science fair. And I was on crutches at this time from another recent surgery, but my mom brought home a microscope from the school. And I went out to the yard with my little test tube in my pocket and I had my dog with me and I collected some pond water and some water from the ditch because in Florida we have pretty deep ditches to keep the land drained from flooding. And I brought these back to the kitchen and just was really blown away at the microscopic world that all of a sudden I could see through this microscope. And I had my little colored pencils and was drawing pictures of protozoa and amoeba and looking up encyclopedias because this is before the internet.
It was all paper.
So you had to stack some encyclopedias to see what each of these were and just referring to those books to understand what all these little creatures were that were squiggling around under the microscope. And that just really was probably the Kickstarter for me of wanting to understand better these different forms of life that were all around us, and yet we didn't always see. And I give a lot of credit to the science fair because from that time in third grade, I basically never stopped doing science fair. I competed every year in middle and high school and went on to state and international competitions. And growing up in a very small rural town, there weren't like a lot of kids like me with this huge interest in science. And those were opportunities for me to meet other kids like me and also just be inspired by their amazing scope of science projects they were doing. And it kind of gave me that extra sense of competition of wanting to do well and wanting to compete with them and expand my own ideas to come up with more and more creative projects. And in a way, really, since high school and college, I've just continued doing science fair projects. My whole life is a science fair project because that's what I get to do today in my lab is guide my students and team as we explore different creative ideas and questions that we want to ask about the natural world.
Oh, definitely. And I understand you also had a pretty fervent interest in medicine as well. So was it difficult for you to really make that decision to commit to science and research?
Oh, absolutely. So I had this fervent curiosity for science. And at the same time, I was also very much entranced with this idea of becoming a physician. I wanted to become a surgeon because those were the people I really looked up to. They were my heroes. They were who were repairing my body every year, sometimes multiple times a year through all of these different surgeries that I underwent. I also spent a lot of time in high school volunteering in the local emergency room and just seeing the excitement and the way that knowledge could be used to heal was really thrilling to me. So when I went to college, I was very heavily set on pre-medical coursework and was, again, majoring in biology and anthropology, but also had a heavy chemistry load. And it was one of those things that, again, happened by chance where I had never even heard of the discipline of anthropology before college. And I took some courses in it. And it was in those courses where you have the study of humankind and cultures. And really, I started to become introduced to these ideas that medicine can be practiced through many different lenses and that not all people, not all cultures across the globe view the body in the same way. And not all cultures view health and the practice of medicine in the same way. In fact, they rely on different forms of practicing medicine than the Western practice of medicine, which is what the only type that I'd been exposed to until then. And it was in a class on tropical ecology that I first read about the field of ethnobotany. And it was just this moment of like, oh, this is something that brings together medicine, nature, culture, different systems of health, all under one umbrella. And that was just a revelation for me because I wasn't being trained in a very interdisciplinary way. I kind of gravitated towards these different disciplines, but it wasn't in a concerted way of like, I'm going to become an interdisciplinary scientist. Those were just the things that I really enjoyed learning about. So I had this unique opportunity to go to Peru this summer after my junior year and learn more about this field of ethnobotany through interning as a volunteer in a garden that was based at a tourist lodge in the middle of the Peruvian Amazon. And to be able to work with a traditional healer, a shaman that took care of the garden. And it was really that experience and also my work with local communities and interviewing mothers about child health during that period that I really was exposed to these insights into both the strengths and the weaknesses of both traditional forms of medicine and Western medicine. And it was kind of there that I found that myself at that crossroads and really a decision point. I was accepted to medical school. And when I got that letter, I didn't feel a sense of elation or ecstatic joy. I mean, I should have just been so happy and so pumped because I'd literally worked my whole life towards getting to that point, to getting to that achievement of opening that door to that next path. But it was in that moment that everything crystallized based off of my time in the Amazon and all of my other studies. And I decided to pursue ethnobotany with the goal of learning how to discover and develop new medicines rather than practicing medicine as a physician.
Certainly. And I understand over the years, Cassandra, you've had so many remarkable experiences, both in the lab and the field. I guess, what would you consider some of these key moments or key things that happened to you along the way that really helped you get to where you are now?
Definitely those early experiences in the Amazon were really integral to my formation as a scientist because based on my didactic training in the university, I had a good understanding of ecology and biology and chemistry and anthropology. But it was really during that time and learning from a traditional healer that I began to appreciate some of those other elements to medicine and health, that not all of healing can be explained simply by pharmacology or by surgical interventions. And remember, my life had been just a series of pharmacologic and surgical interventions. And so this really was an eye-opening kind of moment for me. And then later, I had opportunities to work with other types of healers in the Mediterranean, starting in Italy, and learning about kind of household knowledge. So not just specialist knowledge of specialized healers, but also the knowledge that women, especially the elder women in households, had around different types of plants that were used to treat and mitigate different types of diseases, both physical and spiritual. So it was a journey. It was kind of, I learned along the way. And I'm just really thankful because I really view those healers and those women and men that took the time to meet with me and spend time in long interviews explaining to me the ways that they view the world and the ways that they view medicine and health, because that really was integral to forming the scientist that I am today.
Certainly. And we mentioned specifically you got your undergraduate degrees there at Emory. What was it like then finally coming back, starting your own lab, and then ultimately joining the faculty there?
It was wild. I mean, when I first came back, I came initially as a teaching postdoc. So I remember my first class, I had like an 8 a.m. class, the slot that nobody else wants.
Right. Everyone's favorite.
Although now I teach 8:30 a.m. classes because I like to get up early.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember I had a small group in the classroom, and it was just amazing to be at the front of the room, in the same room where I had taken classes. That was definitely, it took some getting used to for sure. But it's been great to be back and great to be able to share my experiences with the students today. Obviously, things have changed on campus since I was in school in the 90s, but there's a lot of things that are the same, and including some of my former mentors and actually people that continue to be mentors to me, faculty that were here when I was a student that are still here. And it was just really a privilege to be able to get to know them in a different capacity rather than a student, instead as a colleague. And so that was really special.
Oh, absolutely. And a perfect transition. I'd love to talk about some of these mentors next as well. I know as a scientist, these mentors, role models, supporters can be huge in terms of your career and your ability to make it to where you'd like to be. So for you, do any people in particular rise to the top of your mind as people who really had a big impact on you?
I've been fortunate to have many mentors along the way, even beginning in middle school with Miss Betty, who was the clinical microbiology lab director at the hospital where I did a lot of my science fair projects. I mean, she took this kid that had big bangs and braces and was super awkward, gave me the training and access to lab facilities when I was really young. And that was definitely life-changing for me to get that opportunity. And in college, I was really fortunate to have a number of really influential professors. And one that I still work with today, she's actually my current boss in the Center for the Study of Human Health, is Dr. Michelle Lample. She's a MD, PhD, trained in anthropology and medicine. And I would say that out of all of my professors in college, she was the one that really pushed me to think about the primary literature in a way that I'd never been taught to before. So it was a very different way of teaching, of not just, emphasizing rote memorization of facts, but really digging into scientific articles, thinking about how the experiments were designed, critically evaluating how the data was analyzed and presented. And then also just really emphasizing a better understanding, also a better appreciation for paradigm shifts in the history of science. I think from her, I really learned to appreciate history at an even deeper level. And I talk a bit about some of the things that we've learned from the history of paradigm shifts in infectious disease. And it makes me think about what changes will come today and in the future. I think one lesson that is really key is that paradigm shifts are often hard won and take a lot of time to occur. So I think that was definitely an important lesson for me. And she continues to be a great mentor for me today.
Oh, absolutely. And I think these primary sources, this kind of primary literature is maybe specifically very important historically for ethnobotany, going way, way back in these records to learn about some of these ways that people used to treat conditions or some of these natural resources that people are leaning on to help with these health conditions. So what has that been like, kind of going back in the history of the archives and using all of these different kinds of sources to inform your research or to get inspiration or ideas?
First, I'll say I'm so incredibly fortunate to have some incredibly talented students here that work with me on my team, including undergraduates. I can think of a couple of examples. On our work on pepper tree, one of my former students, she's now already finished medical school and is a practicing infectious disease physician, but she'd worked on pepper tree. And I told her, go back and see how far back you can find records of this. And she actually went back all the way to a record that was published, I believe, in the 1600s in Latin.
Oh, wow.
And was able to identify records of how this plant was used historically in Brazil, based on records from a Dutch naturalist that was traveling the region then. And that was just fascinating. I had another student who was able to read block Mandarin text, and she too went back several centuries to some old records that we had here in the archives. And her project was on the plant Ginkgo biloba. And she was able to find records of how the seed coats were used to treat skin disease, which we don't think of when we think of ginkgo today. We think of using the leaves as kind of a supplement for mental health purposes and memory. But she had found these really interesting records. And in fact, we were able to investigate those seeds and understand their pharmacological activities against different bacteria that are implicated in skin disease. So it's a lot of fun. But I think it's important to really highlight that when you read about scientific research, it's often the PI, the lab leader, is the one that's being interviewed or quoted in the news. But really, the groundwork is being done by these really incredibly dedicated students. And I'm just so proud of them and what they've gone on to do with their own careers. So that's been a lot of fun.
Oh, that is fantastic. And I'd love to dive into some of the details of the science. I know you've got quite a few different projects going along at the same time there in the lab, but is there one in particular, Cassandra, that you are maybe the most excited about at the moment that you'd like to tell us more about?
Yeah, so we have a couple of different projects going on. I think some of our recent work where we have isolated and discovered compounds that act against staphylococcal virulence are really important for me. This goes back to, again, our work on pepper tree, but also our work on the European chestnut. And we were able to isolate compounds that specifically target the ability of staphylococci to produce virulence factors. So specifically these toxins that can lyse red blood cells and toxins that can destroy and disrupt like the skin barrier, basically, and are destructive to tissues. So that's definitely one that I'm really interested in pushing further along. I'm really interested in seeing if we can find ways to bring this closer to the clinic with more preclinical studies, especially for topical applications and treating diseases like atopic dermatitis, where we have heavy staff involvement. And we know that based on some of our studies on clinical isolates, we know that there are strain-specific differences where kids that have more severe disease actually are colonized with these high toxin producers. So that's one where I'm really feeling good about for the future for potential translational applications in the clinic. Some of our other earlier phase work is we are also working on a COVID project as well. We were fortunate to receive funding to screen our entire library using a pseudotyped virion model, which is biosafety level 2 safe, to examine our library. And we have completed the screen now against wild type virus. We're doing some work now on some of the variants and have identified a few botanicals that have really potent activity in blocking viral entry. So basically the virus that causes COVID, SARS-CoV-2, we were able to identify some plants that interfere with that interface between the spike protein and the ACE2 receptor. Still very early days on that. We still have to isolate the compounds that are responsible for those activities, but it's really exciting because I think that unfortunately, COVID isn't going to be going away anytime soon. And we have other coronavirus threats that might come out in the future. And so we're hopeful that this will lead to potentially new therapies that could be used either in prophylaxis or prevention of transmission or reduction of risk in transmission or as direct antiviral treatments. So those are probably the two I'm most excited about right now.
Wonderful. And I know taking discoveries from the lab into the clinic is very challenging, but also very exciting. And we mentioned in our introduction that you also have this startup company, PhytoTEK. So how does this factor in? And I guess how is that going in terms of translating some of the work that you're doing into things that might make an impact?
So PhytoTEK is a company that I co-founded with my business partner while I was near the end of my postdoctoral training period. And we licensed out my first patent, which is a technology that's based on a formula derived from the roots of blackberry plants. So in particular, the original discovery was made from Rubus ulmifolius, which is the elm leaf blackberry in the Mediterranean. And in the Med, they use this particular plant to treat skin infections. They also use it to treat hair loss as well. And we haven't done any studies on the hair loss aspect, but are definitely interested in the skin treatments for skin infection. So what we were able to do is we have sublicensed out the technology to another company that specializes in getting in the medical device industry. And they're working on the final prototypes now for a medicated bandage that includes our formula that's embedded into the bandage. It's an all-natural alginate-based medical bandage dressing. And the idea is to use this to treat patients that have chronic, long-term open bed wounds that are typically also colonized and infected with bacterial biofilms. We know that our formula works by blocking both the adhesion of staphylococci, that kind of initial adhesion step in forming a biofilm, but we also know that in combination with antibiotics or other antimicrobials, including other plant-derived antimicrobials, that it can reduce the overall level of biofilm adhering to the surface. So the claims on this device are for preventing fouling of the bandage, and our hope is that this will be something that will be of use to patients that have these kind of long, chronic, open infected wounds for conditions like leg ulcers from bed sores, or also for diabetic foot ulcers. So the great thing about collaborating, I'm big into collaborating with people that have expertise in different fields, is like they've been down these paths before in terms of getting medical devices through regulatory approval. And we are hopeful that this will also do well when it's submitted for 510(k) approval next year.
Phenomenal. Well, Cassandra, it sounds like you've got a lot going on, but you sort of portray the sort of calm, like you've got everything under control vibe. And I know there are challenges, there are struggles, there are failures, and so many things happen beyond your control. And you have to keep going. So for you, has there been a time that you can tell us about where you really had a major struggle or a failure that you had a difficult time working through that you could tell us about?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the one that immediately comes to mind happened in graduate school. I had spent months and months away from my husband and with a young child, with our first son, who came into the field with me when he was only 5 or 6 months old. And I'd spent all this time intensively working again on my own because I didn't have a lab team then. It was just me in the field, and collecting these boxes and boxes of plants to be shipped back to the lab in Miami, where I was going to graduate school, for me to use for all of my laboratory portion of my dissertation research. And the first box made it through and went to the inspection center, and I was able to get it released from quarantine, and I was able to start with working on those extracts. But the other boxes did not come through.
Oh, no.
And for some inexplicable reason, they arrived in Miami and then were promptly shipped back on a boat to Italy. And in that process, records had been lost on where they actually were, where they were going. I was in a panic, like we couldn't track these things down. And I remember distinctly going to my PhD advisor, Professor Brad Bennett at FIU, and just telling him this sob story, like, what am I going to do? I mean, I couldn't afford financially to have another field season. And I really didn't want to have that long period of separation again for our young family to be able to conduct this field work. And I talk about this in the book, but he just gave me this advice from the story of a historical figure, a scientist, a botanist known as Rumphius, who himself had also lost samples through a number of different disasters. And the short version of the story is, in the end, his work was published and was incredibly important and still is important as a reference today. But it wasn't published until he was long dead.
Not very comforting.
I just remember thinking, this is supposed to encourage me. You know, he's like, things worked out for him. It'll work out for you. And I'm like, I cannot wait that long for my samples to come in. Eventually, they did show up back at my in-laws' house in Italy. Just one day they popped up and they were incredible, and actually flew them back over as luggage, brought them to Miami as luggage so that we didn't lose them again. So that's probably the biggest kind of challenge I encountered. Luckily, that did get resolved in the end.
Oh my goodness. And I love this sort of advice from your mentor as well. This sort of, it could always be worse mentality that it's still.
Yeah.
So for you, how did you recover in the meantime? It sounds like there was quite a gap between when that package went missing and when it eventually ultimately popped up here. So what kept you going? What kept you from throwing in the towel and saying, this is ridiculous, I can't do this anymore?
Oh my gosh, there's been so many times where I've had those moments of like, do I throw it in? Luckily, I did have one box that had come in. And so I was able to start working on those. And I was able to spend time really digging deeper into the literature to kind of prepare some of my introductory sections from my publications. And so I was able to keep busy with those things until they arrived. And there definitely have been challenges encountered at many, many different stages in many different forms. And I think at the heart of things, it really is my passion. I think if there's any advice I can give to anyone that's interested in pursuing science is that you should do it in a field that you're really passionate about, that it really brings you joy and satisfaction to do this work. It really fuels your intellectual curiosity and fills you up. Because I think if I didn't have that passion, I would have left a long time ago. But it's that passion that's kept me in the game.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for talking us through one of these tough times. It sounds like a nightmare situation for any PhD student out there. But let's switch gears and talk about successes next. I know you've got so many wonderful successes to celebrate. Cassandra, do you have a favorite success story, whether it was a big win or maybe just a small but particularly meaningful one that you'd like to share?
I think going back to that story of the quorum sensing inhibitors as virulence inhibitors, I think that story for me is a success story. I mean, in many different small increments, it's been a success because here we have examples of things that would have been dismissed as not having therapeutic value by classic approaches. So what I mean by that is in the field, if you have a plant that is reportedly used to treat an infection, and then once it's subjected to a battery of tests to see if it actually has any growth inhibitory or classic antibiotic activity against different infectious pathogens, and it shows up with no activity, there are many examples of plants that just kind of are dismissed and tossed aside. And that tradition of medicine that uses that plant is in some cases called into doubt as, is this just a placebo? This doesn't work. And I think what I've learned from both traditional medical practitioners and from the plants themselves is that things don't always work because perhaps we're not always either equipped to or have the capacity to ask the right questions, that maybe we haven't even dreamt up the right questions. So I think with this lesson learned with the quorum sensing inhibitors is that it really taught me that there's more than one way to treat an infection. And that in the end, the goal of a traditional healer is not to kill the bacterial pathogen, it's to heal the patient. And so for me, that's really a success story of being able to use the tools that we have available to us today in science to really dig in and understand and reveal the mechanism by which these medicines work. For me, that's a success.
Certainly. And I think you brought up a really good point that there's this sort of pervasive but limited perspective or even desire, I guess, to simplify things down to just one active ingredient, one active component. And that might not be how things work. So how do you battle this sort of deeply ingrained belief or way of operating?
That's probably my biggest challenge when it comes to grant funding. Because I think intellectually, conceptually, I believe that nature creates this milieu of compounds for a specific purpose. And I think that in many cases in natural systems, it's the combination of many compounds that yields that desired phenotype. So if you think about this from the perspective of a plant, maybe the desired outcome is to attract a pollinator. And so there are certain compounds that the plant produces that yield a beautiful color, and other maybe volatile compounds that are produced that yield an aromatic odor that can attract a pollinator. So it's that confluence of different compounds that are being produced, or perhaps it's a defense purpose. So perhaps they're trying to defend against a microbial pathogen, because plants are also, by the way, subject to infection by viruses, by bacteria, by pathogenic fungi. So they too have to defend their tissues. Unlike animals, plants can't just get up and run away from a threat or go towards what they need. So they rely on these chemical signals. So from this kind of conceptual perspective, I really believe that this is where the power of plant-derived medicines really lies, is in those complex mixtures that are perhaps hitting on multiple targets to yield that overall final effect that is desired in the medical practice. I've also learned that the little details that healers have over, for example, at what age the plant should be when you collect it, or what time of day, or what part should be collected, how should it be stored. And sometimes these practices are kind of embedded within ritual and kind of spiritual frameworks that sound very strange to a Western scientist. But in reality, they may actually have really important implications for the chemical makeup of the final therapeutic product. And those differences in chemical makeup, of course, will yield different pharmacological effects. We've seen this, for example, with St. John's wort. We did some work on St. John's wort. The flowering tops of the plant are, of course, used in supplements, kind of as an antidepressant in dietary supplements for complementary medicine in the West. But in places like Albania and Kosovo and in the Balkans, they actually don't make an alcoholic tincture of this. Instead, they soak the flowers in a bottle of oil, often like an olive oil, leave that in the sun for 40 days until it turns blood red. And then they use that topically to treat skin irritations and infections. And when we looked at the chemistry of the traditional formulation, that oil formulation versus the formulations that are sold in broad commerce, the chemical makeup was different and the pharmacological properties were different, including the safety profiles were different. So I think there's a lot of detail that we have to learn about, not just which plants to use, but also how they're prepared, and all those different minutiae that go into their preparation is important. Now, when it comes to grant applications, it's really difficult for me to sell this idea of complex mixtures. In fact, it's probably been one of my biggest critiques I get consistently in grant proposals. And so I'm very much pushed towards a reductionist approach to science in order to get funded. And so these approaches include classic bioassay-guided fractionation techniques to isolate individual compounds and study them individually. And we do that in the lab. We definitely do that. And I think there is value to that. It's important to understand the chemical scaffolds that are responsible for activities. But I also try and remember that it's often not just going to be down to that one single compound, but there may be other compounds present that can really help to yield that overall valued or desired effect. We also know that when you do treat infectious diseases with single compounds, and I'll give you an example of an important medicinal plant, that of wormwood, and the compound artemisinin. And a Nobel Prize, by the way, was awarded for the discovery of artemisinin for treating malaria. We now have broad spread artemisinin resistance because when you take that single compound and put that direct selective pressure on your pathogen, on your parasite in this case, that opens up room for evolution and emergence of resistance. And we see this, of course, with antibiotics as well. It's a constant battle of treating bacteria with antibiotics. And if a small subpopulation survives that treatment, you can then have gene exchange or other mutations that could lead to resistance. Now, when polypharmacology comes into play, where you have multiple compounds hitting on those, perhaps even at different targets, that can help to reduce the risks of generation of resistance. And in fact, we see this with malaria. There have been studies published that have shown that whole leaf therapy with the artemisinin-bearing plant, with the Artemisia species, can still remain effective against even artemisinin-resistant parasites. And so there's a lot we have to learn, and we need to get more comfortable in evaluating these polypharmacologies and get more comfortable with our scientific tools in assessing these complex networks of compounds.
Certainly. Well, we appreciate you going into some of the details and talking about this exciting success with a part of the research that you're doing there in the lab. And throughout our conversation, we've hinted at the idea that you have been to so many places for science, whether it was field opportunities, conferences. And I think these opportunities are great ways to connect with people across the world who are excited about the same things you are. You've been to Italy, the Amazon, Albania, Kosovo, many other places. So if I had to make you pick here, Cassandra, do you have a favorite place that your science has taken you?
There are some places that you travel to that kind of remain seared in your mind. And I had an opportunity to travel to Indonesia, to the island of Sumatra. And there I saw a number of things that were just amazing to me. We were in an orangutan preserve as part of a field trip during the conference. And I remember distinctly squealing like so loud. I was so excited on what I'd seen in the forest, and other conference attendees with me were like, "Did you see an orangutan?" And I'm like, "No, there's a Titan arum like right there off the trail." which many of the audience may know as the huge stinky flower that smells like rotting flesh. It's a big favorite in many botanic gardens. There's a lot of fanfare when they go into bloom. And I'd seen not in flowering state, but in the vegetative state. So it was like the large leaf that looks almost like a tree. I saw it in the forest. And I don't know, that was just really special for me because it had been one of those plants I was fascinated with because the chemistry of that plant's interesting. The fact that it can create this amazing perfume that's reminiscent of rotting carcass to attract its pollinators is just really cool. So that was one place I really enjoyed traveling to.
That is amazing. Were you able to see the orangutans as well while you were there?
I did see the orangutans as well.
Oh, good.
And they were amazing. It was one of those experiences that's both amazing, but also deeply depressing because orangutan habitats on the island have been increasingly threatened by these large plantations for palm oil cultivation. So palm oil goes into a lot of our processed foods and a lot of our cookies and a lot of our shelf-stable snacks that we consume in the U.S. and abroad. And on one hand, it was amazing. On the other hand, I was deeply, deeply aware of how threatened these habitats were for both the plants and the wildlife and the orangutans.
Absolutely. And I think some of these travel opportunities are great ways to combat stereotypes in science, but I think they still persist. I think in the media, especially scientists and science is portrayed a particular way. We're all very serious, critical in lab coats, things of that nature. But I think this is not the case for so many of the scientists that I've met over the years. I think many of them are creative, funny people who have their own quirks and personalities. So do you have an example of maybe a lab tradition that goes contrary to one of these stereotypes or just someone that you've met along the way?
I have a good story for this. So a number of years ago, I traveled to South Africa for another conference. And one of the postdoctoral researchers in my lab at the time, Dr. James Lyles, was with me. And he's now moved on to a scientist position in pharma and in biotech. But at the time, we were wrapping up this amazing conference in the Western Cape of South Africa. And if you've ever traveled to South Africa, there is a town on the west known as Stellenbosch. And it's a beautiful, beautiful wine country, basically. So we had our flight back to the U.S. later that day. And so it was close enough to Cape Town that we could kind of stop and see some of the vineyards before we left. And I remember one of the first places that we stopped had this beautiful view of the countryside. It was up on a hill, just gorgeous. The forest was at the side of the winery and you saw the fields and fields of grapevines. And we sat out there, and as you do when you go to a wine tasting, in this case, we were seated outdoors, and the person that comes and explains the vintages and gives you the small tastings was in the process of explaining a really lovely rosé when all of a sudden he put the bottle down and started jumping around and waving his hands like really a very absurd, weird way. We're like, what is happening? He's just, making his body really big and jumping around and yelling. And then we turned behind us and there were a troop of baboons approaching us. Apparently they like to come up and kind of nab purses and items from the tourist or food. Mm-hmm. So he had to stop in his explanation to get the baboons to go away. So we, of course, when we got back to the US, I was like, I have to buy more of that rosé. So I ordered it and had it shipped to the US. And so anytime we had a big paper published, we had to do the monkey dance. We popped open a bottle of rosé and all danced around with a big hand waving because it was just, I don't know. So it's a very quirky lab tradition I can think of that we have.
Oh, that is amazing. So if you had to describe the moves of the monkey dance, what does it look like?
If you can just imagine that you're standing, you kind of put your arms up over your head and to the side, kind of like a tree pose, and you're waving them back and forth and just trying to make your body look as big and as loud as possible. And just kind of dancing around like that.
That is amazing. Perhaps the same sort of stance you might take if you were faced with a bear or other large predator. Yeah. Look big and scary.
Although I don't know if dancing in front of a bear would have been as funny. I mean, they ran away, so it wasn't like a threatening, scary situation. It was just funny.
Right. Oh, that is amazing. And I think it does really highlight some of these unexpected situations that come up when you're out there going to all these different places and exploring new cultures. So I absolutely love this story. And I know you highlighted some of the wonderful projects that you're working on in the lab at the moment and the directions that those projects are going. But in science, as of course, in all ways of life, there are barriers, whether it's for you, staff, technology, feasibility, funding. So for you, if you had no barriers, Cassandra, is there one project that you are just the most excited about that you would want to tackle first?
If I had the resources right now, I'm really eager to get some of these discoveries out of the lab and into the clinic. And that takes a lot of money. It takes the right expertise on your team. When it comes to drug discovery and development, there's this phase known as the Valley of Death. And this is kind of where drugs go to die, right? Once you have a lead molecule, something that you know that works really well in your laboratory models and in your animal models, and you want to get it ready for that next step, get it ready for the IND application or investigational new drug application, that's where the Valley of Death happens, because that's really where you need a lot more of the preclinical studies. And, academic labs aren't always well suited or set up for a lot of the preclinical pharmacology studies that have to be done on how the drug's metabolized, more intensive safety concerns before you put it into humans. And so I think if I had unlimited resources, I would really apply those resources towards pushing our antivirulence technology closer to the clinic by getting those preclinical studies done, filing the IND, and starting some clinical trials. I would probably start again with atopic dermatitis, because I think these antivirulence therapeutics have a number of different applications for helping to reduce morbidity and mortality in aggressive staph infections. But I think an easier place to start would be in topical applications for these kids that really, it's not a life-threatening disease, but they do suffer greatly. It can be very painful, very itchy, really diminishes quality of life for so many children that are affected by severe atopic dermatitis, which the audience might also know as severe eczema. And this would be a first-in-class new approach to dealing with that disease. And I see huge potential for it if I can just get through that valley and get it into humans.
I think that is a steep hill to climb for so many people who are in your area of this drug discovery and research and development that you mentioned. So good luck to you as you navigate that.
Thank you.
And I know for our listeners out there who perhaps are in need of some advice, whether it's for life or science, getting advice from people who've been through it can be so helpful. So Cassandra, for you, when you look back on your career, is there one piece of advice that really helped you that you could pay forward to our listeners today?
One piece of advice that I constantly remind myself of is not to neglect my own wellness and health. I think that whether you're driven by work because of high expectations of your performance, or whether you're driven by a fiery passion to pursue the thing that you love, finding that balance of ensuring that you're not neglecting your physical health and your mental health is so incredibly important. And it's not always easy to do. I mean, I've struggled with it as well. When things just get so busy, sometimes the first thing to go is your own self-care. And so I would say my advice to anyone would be to prioritize self-care in addition to all the other things that you're doing in work. And, also prioritize your social relationships, whether it's with friends or with family, because those are really special and time is limited. And so I would say those are really important. I'm also really a big believer in organization. I couldn't do what I do without having things very organized. And I kind of live by my calendar, and that's my source of comfort, because I know I'm able to ensure that I can plan in my morning swim is on my calendar before my workday starts. And I do the swim with a friend. So I get to hit both of those boxes. It's uplifting to see her in the morning, and I get in that 40-minute swim and get out, and I'm able to start my day really refreshed and energized. So whatever form of exercise, I think it's nice if you can do it with a friend, because that can really help get your day started off right.
Absolutely. And I'm a big believer in organization myself. Everything's on a list in a spreadsheet organized on my calendar. So wonderful advice for our listeners out there. Cassandra, is there any other last piece of advice, or maybe a last note of inspiration you'd like to share with everybody out there at the end of our conversation?
One other piece of advice would really be to think about your network carefully, about the different players in your network. So we often talk about mentorship, and mentors are incredibly important, but there are other players that are just as important to your development as a scientist. So one of my most fortunate things I have is we've really cultivated a group of colleagues in the field. I mean, they're spread across Canada and US and Europe. And we have a regular call every 2 weeks just to talk about our lives and kind of keep in touch, and having that kind of social network of people that understand what life as a scientist is like in your field. That's important. Mentors are incredibly important to giving you that key advice, but so are sponsors. And sponsors, they're not always maybe as easy to define, but these are people that can help open up new opportunities for you that you may not even be aware of, or they're the people that might nominate you for things. It's important to cultivate relationships with sponsors, let them know how you're doing, what you're doing, and make them aware that you're looking for opportunities, because when things come across their desk, they're going to think of you for that. So I think, friends, sponsors, and mentors are all key players to really give some time to cultivating those relationships.
Fantastic advice for our listeners. And I think it's a particularly good point for early career scientists. I think mentorship is something everybody talks about, but sponsorship, this idea of having people who will kind of boost you up, who will recommend you for these opportunities that you might not be aware of, is something that people don't necessarily talk about as much, but can be very equally important for getting you to that next position.
Absolutely. And I think it can sometimes be difficult, especially for in my experience, for women to make those asks. I mean, I myself, I've struggled with that. I don't like to feel like I'm a burden on anyone. And sometimes I'll take on others' burdens, but don't want to ever ask them to do something for me. It just makes me so uncomfortable to ask for help. And I think we need to remember it is okay to ask for help. And it's an important part of the process.
Absolutely. Well, Cassandra, you have shared some exceptional insights with us today, both in terms of advice, scientific insights, and also parts of your personal story. And you share even more in your recently released book. So I do want to give you a big congratulations on this, as well as tell our listeners a little bit more about how they can find that book and how they can learn more about you. So what's the best way?
Thanks so much. So you can find me on my website. It's CassandraQuave.com. That's my author website, and it's spelled CassandraQuave.com. You can find links to the Plant Hunter there. It is on sale as of October 12th in the US, Canada, and the UK. We also have some deals underway for different languages that I hope to be able to announce in the coming months to be available in other countries soon as well. You can also find it with any bookseller will be carrying it, and it'll also be at your local library. If you're interested in accessing copies of the scientific research papers from my group, you can also visit our research website, and that's at ethnobotanica.us. That's ethnobotanica.us. And we have copies of our papers there. And lastly, you can follow me on social media. If you like social media, I'm pretty active on Twitter and Instagram, and my handle there is @Quave Ethnobot, and it's QUAVEETHNOBOT. I probably should have picked easier handles to spell, but it is what it is. So it's Quave Ethnobot on both of those.
Oh, perfect. Well, listeners, definitely check out Cassandra's book. I've read it and I can highly recommend it. Also, definitely look at those resources on her websites, learn more about the amazing work she's doing in the lab, and get connected on social media. Cassandra, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the show today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great speaking with you.
Well, we've enjoyed our time together, listeners. Great to have you here as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science.